Welcome to Insight. President Trump says the U.S. has reached a trade deal with Vietnam, giving full market access to American companies while slapping a 20% tariff on all Vietnamese imports. This deal would be the third following framework agreements with the U.K. and China ahead of Trump's July 9th deadline. For more details on the deal, let's bring in Vietnam Bureau Chief Francesca Stevens. Francesca, well, 20% is lower than 46, but it's still very high. What do we know about this deal?
Yeah, that's right, Haslinda. Well, the call that everyone in Vietnam had been waiting for happened just after 9 p.m. local time last night, after which, as you said, we heard that there's a trade deal with Vietnam that will see a 20% tariff on Vietnamese exports to the U.S. and a 40% tariff on any goods deemed to be transshipped through the country. And in return, Vietnam agreed to drop all levies on U.S. imports, and that had actually been one of the opening offers from TOLAM when the 46% tariff was first announced back in April. In a statement from the Vietnamese side last night, Lam also proposed that the US recognize Vietnam as a market economy and remove export restrictions on certain high-tech goods. Now, during weeks of intense diplomacy, Vietnam had repeatedly promised to purchase more American goods, including LNG and aircraft, so we might start to see some more details emerge from those kind of agreements. Multiple senior Vietnamese officials had flown to the US to rally support and sign deals over the last few weeks in a bid to show the US it was serious about addressing the trade imbalance, which Vietnam has one of the biggest trade surpluses with the US, and that's what partly made it such a prime tariff target. And we're still waiting to see the full details of the agreement. Vietnam's cabinet is meeting this morning, and we may hear some more comments after that meeting.
Details few and far between. What are still missing? What's still in question?
Yeah, well, as you said, many details are still missing and many questions still outstanding. One business chamber told me this morning that assessing the pros and cons of this deal is really difficult at this stage without seeing any of those further details. And that's being echoed by many of the analysts my colleague Zhang has been speaking to, who are saying that the market needs more clarity on what goods and export sectors will be impacted. It's not clear how the higher 40% rate imposed on goods deemed to be transshipped that appears to target China will be enforced or enacted, and whether that's on all goods or specific sectors. China is Vietnam's largest trading partner, and Vietnam is heavily reliant on China for the raw essentials needed to maintain its manufacturing growth. So a big question now is what it means for Vietnam's trade relations with China. In fact, a Bloomberg economic analysis this morning says the deal risks provoking retaliatory steps from China. So Vietnam will really need to work out how best to continue to maintain strong relationships with both the US and China. Plenty of details still to come on this, and interesting times ahead for us in Vietnam for sure.
And Francesca, US cars are set to get preferential access. How significant is that?
I think it's really too early to say at this stage, Haslinda. I mean, that's one of the few details that was set out in the agreement. But like so many things, the terms of this are very vague. I wouldn't like to try and explain how that is going to play out when we're still, looking to see how much we can glean from this at this stage. And like I say, we do expect to see more details of this agreement emerge over the next few weeks, when we'll start to get a clearer picture of what that impact will really be.
Francesca, thank you so much for that perspective. Vietnam Bureau Chief Francesca Stevens there. Now, caution dominates trading here in Asia, even after news of the trade deal between the U.S. and Vietnam sent Wall Street to a fresh record high. Let's get more from Bloomberg MLive strategist Mary Nicola. Well, cautious here, but I don't know, perhaps euphoria in the U.S. They're looking at clarity. We're looking at what's going to happen to the rest of the trade deals with Asian countries.
Yeah, there was a lot of excitement overnight in equity markets in the U.S. And to be honest, from an Asia perspective, it really is hard to understand because at the end of the day, we started this month at 10% tariffs, and now we're going into 20% for Vietnam. So does that set a new precedent? Is that a new bar for where levies are headed? And if that is the case, there's going to be a lot of nerves rippling through because 10% you could arguably say was tolerable, but another 20%. And then, of course, what we're seeing with Vietnam, they're not addressing the sectoral tariffs, which has been some of the key issues and the key sticking points for the likes of Japan and Korea. So a lot of these issues that are still heavily involving the countries in the region aren't being ironed out. And of course, there's a lack of clarity still. And that, of course, is going to weigh on sentiment here in the region.
So you got to wonder how attractive Vietnam assets will be now that we have clarity it's going to be imposed with 20% tariffs.
Yeah, I think obviously there's going to be a clear hit on the economy as a result of it. But we have to keep in mind that the U.S. is one of the largest trading partners with Vietnam. And of course, the impact of this 40% tariff on transshipped goods. Granted, there's a lack of understanding of how that'll be tracked. But at the same time, there is still going to be some. Even if you ignore that transshipment part aside and putting that aside, you still have an impact because of how big and important the U.S. is as a trading partner for Vietnam.
And also China as a trading partner for Vietnam. You got to see what the response is from China.
Yeah, because that is clearly targeting China when they're putting an imposition of 40% transshipped. We know that a lot of China had moved a lot of its manufacturing into Vietnam, of course, because we saw higher labor costs in China. So that has been part of a long-term transition. So if it relies on China for inputs, et cetera, there is going to be a longer-term implication. So what China is worried now is this is clearly an attack, and so is there a risk of a retaliation?